The JLR interview series.
Hi, this is Andrea Vicari, and you're listening to Jazz Doodles on jazzlondonradio.com. I'm here with my guest, Vijay Iyer, and we're going to be talking about his new album and what he's been doing in his musical life. He's a composer, a jazz pianist, an educator, academic. I think feel free to tell me if I've missed anything out. You've got a new album out, Vijay, called Uneasy with Linda May Hanno and Tishorn Sori on the ECM label. And it's mostly your compositions, and it features a new trio lineup. Your previous trio featured Stephen Crump and Marcus Gilmore. And I wondered if you found working with different musicians allows your music to develop in different ways, and perhaps if you wanted to talk a little bit about this new album.
Sure. Yeah. Well, all of these musicians are people I've worked with for a very long time. Both Stefan Crump and Tyshawn Sawyer I've worked with for more than 20 years. Kind of constantly, in fact, over that period. Marcus, I started working with when he was very young, but that was also in about 2003 or 2004. He was still a teenager. And we've been all over this planet together in all different configurations. Linda Mehan O is, as you may know, like just leading light of contemporary bass playing. She's from Australia. She came to the US in the early mid 2000s, and I've been working with her for about 10 years. So we're all sort of part of one larger family or community, I would say, of musicians who are kind of just in the world together, doing a lot of different things together. And Linda and Tyshawn and I had played many times in different configurations in larger groups, because all three of us were often faculty together at this program in Canada, the Banff International Workshop in Jazz and Creative Music, which Tyshawn and I had co-directed for several years. And we would often bring Linda up as guest faculty and find ourselves playing together in like the faculty ensemble with a whole bunch of people. And then a couple of times in 2019, we had a chance to just play as a trio, and something kind of snapped into place into focus that we hadn't really noticed before, that this was like really a special feeling together, so to bring that into the foreground, the sort of care and precision and joy and buoyancy of pulse that we had together, and it's kind of exuberance in playing, had a very nice feeling. So we just wanted to make that documented and make an album with that band. I'm still playing with all of those guys in different ways. But yes, I was known for close to a decade for this trio with Marcus and Stefan. We made 3 albums, the last of which was Break Stuff on ECM in 2015 or 16. I can't remember now.
I read it was 2015, but
yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Who knows if that. Well, should we have a listen to one of the tracks? So you mentioned we should listen to Hood. Is there anything you wanted to say about this track before we hear it?
Well, the piece is named after and dedicated to Robert Hood, who was a pioneer, one of the innovators of Detroit techno. So it has a very specific kind of way of organizing itself rhythmically. It's basically a dance track, but it's kind of played by an acoustic band, and it has a beautiful lightness to it. I love the way Marcus plays and the drive of it all.
If you've just tuned in, I'm speaking to my guest, Vijay Iyer, and we're talking about his latest album and his life in music. I'm going to move on to this latest album, which you've been talking about, Uneasy. And I feel there's a large element of improvisation, being jazz, but also the style of music even the tunes have a sort of very loose feel, a lot of them, and different grooves as well. So I was listening to the album, and you can hear, I was trying to think how to describe it, sort of more atmospheric, slightly free tunes such as augury, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, to a more groove-based tunes such as Drummer's Song and Retrofit. You also included a standard, Night and Day, which I know you said was, well, I read it somewhere that you were influenced by the Joe Henderson alternative chords. So there's a lot of variety. I can hear some jazz language in your playing, but other influences. So I suppose this is quite a big question, but I'm just wondering how you developed your compositional style and playing.
It is a big question because I've been, banging my head against the piano and my hands for like most of my life, and I've tried just about everything, but I can say that I've listened and studied a lot of pianists, particularly from Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, Andrew Hill, Randy Weston, McCoy Tyner, certainly like Red Garland and Wynton Kelly, Cecil Taylor, Sun Ra, Alice Coltrane, Herbie Nichols, Elmo Hope. I've studied all of their music, and especially Jerry Allen, who you mentioned, Drummer's Song. That's a composition of hers, in fact, and she was a huge hero of mine and an influence, and became a friend, and I got to know her quite well. And I was very lucky to know her in this lifetime, and so that piece is included on there as an homage to her, and it was also just an occasion to study her music again and get in a little deeper with it. I also grew up playing Western classical music on violin, and so that kind of been in my ear since I was a little kid, and now I'm kind of known also as a composer for classical soloists and ensembles and so forth. So not that I'm trying to make stuff that sounds classical, but at least like a different sense of what's possible with harmony and form and texture. That's maybe a little. I try to just have an expansive view of all of that, basically learning from the great composers and pianists. Muhal, Richard Abrams, and Mary Lou Williams, all these people. I've had an ongoing connection to, I guess, what's called the avant-garde. I've had a lot of collaborative relationships with members of the AACM, like Wadada Leo Smith, Roscoe Mitchell, Henry Threadgill. And so I learned a lot about music making and composition, and just sort of like just the extremes of what's possible from working with those folks and from studying their music, and having to learn it and play it, and creating stuff with them. So that's a few different strands. And I grew up listening to pop music, like, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so a lot of soul, and like, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Prince. Prince was my idol as a teenager, and studying their music too, and learning about form and texture and rhythm and melody and orchestration from them, about like what you can make a band do, how you can bring it to life, how you can distribute energy through the ensemble and across the spectrum of sound. And so it's a lot of different things. I guess it's hard to really pin it down. The last thing I'll say is that my parents are from India, and at some point when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, I started to think about like, well, what is that? So then I started studying on my own terms, like not in any formal way, but studying different aspects of Indian classical music, both South Indian and North Indian, to the point where at least I could like work with musicians from those traditions. And so I've done a lot of that as well. I've collaborated with a lot of people with Carnatic and Hindustani and Qawwali backgrounds as musicians.
Well, that's a great answer to a very, very long, well, a question that needed quite a lot of answering, a lot of information there. I was going to play Retrofit, and this is from your new album, Uneasy. One of the reasons I was quite interested, I have heard it, but before I even heard it, was there was a feeling of, I read that you were influenced by Dilla beats, and that's the sort of groove, which apparently, I learned this, that apparently it's to do with, the beats that the DJ does, and they're slightly out of time with each other, and you get this kind of sort of slightly laid back kind of groove. So I don't know if that was true or if someone just written it, but I can hear it in there.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I didn't mention in that long litany was hip hop, but I grew up with the beginnings of the very first, instances of hip hop. I remember hearing Grandmaster Flash and Run DMC in the early 80s, and I became a fan of Public Enemy, and then I remember when De La Soul's albums came out and Tribe Called Quest's album, and they're all of their early albums, and that was where I first heard Jay Dilla's production. It was with Tribe Called Quest, and certainly, yeah, like that kind of influenced a whole generation of musicians. And then the way that showed up in live music making, like on D'Angelo's album Voodoo, is a good example, where you hear people kind of expressing time in that very specific way. That's very specific, with that kind of lean to it, that sort of a certain kind of laid back swagger or something like that. And so that's influenced all of us, I would say. I mean, certainly Tyshawn and me very directly, and it's something that comes up even in this piece. I'm
going to come on to it's to do with music, but obviously it's to do with politics as well. And I think as musicians, most musicians seem to have opinions on politics and various things that happen in the world. We seem to be a profession that seems to be much more aware than, say, other people, of injustices. And I mean, I read all the time, and I'm amazed at how many people don't really know what's going on in the world. But I always think musicians are clued up. And one of your tracks on Uneasy is called Combat Breathing. And again, I read that you composed the piece after the death of Eric Garner in 2014, who was killed by police when he was held in a prohibited chokehold. And I wondered if you feel it's your social responsibility, or you or us as musicians or artists, to bring attention to these kind of injustices in society.
I'm not sure I would speak at such in a prescriptive way like that. Like I think artists do what they feel called to do, and it's not up to me to tell them what that is or anything like that. But you can learn something about an artist from what they feel called to do. And it is true, like you say, that a lot of us who are music makers and who travel around and kind of see a different slice of the world through that way of life, we end up, one thing that I can't remember who said it, maybe it was, actually I won't remember who said it, but basically musicians end up interacting with people from every class background, because of the way that we often have to, like, if you play at a venue or a concert hall, you have to enter through the service entrance, and you end up like kind of getting to know the person who's just sitting by the door taking your name or something, and then you get to know the people who are working sound, the people who are cleaning up. That you end up spending a lot of time with those folks, even though you might be there to play for a bunch of patrons who paid like $50 to see you or something. So actually, and then certainly for me, as the musician that I am, I've worked with a lot of people who didn't go to college, like who didn't have that opportunity or that privilege, that chance. So a lot of self-taught musicians, or a lot of people who learned from the church or learned from their parents or something like that, but didn't like have the benefit of formal so-called music education. And I've found that those have been some of the most brilliant artists I've ever met, you know. I mean, I get to, you know, so I've found that I am often among people who come from precarious living situations and who are still in them often. I'm privileged not to be in such a position myself because my parents were gainfully employed, and I am too now because I have a teaching job. But certainly, like I've found myself apprenticing with people of lesser means than myself, you know, and so like I think all of that, and particularly this is Black music. You know, I've apprenticed with elder Black musicians, and what does that mean? Especially in a U.S. context, it means that it's not just a form; it's a community, it's people, and to then like realize the degree to which their lives are in danger. You know, so then like I have a very direct indebtedness to people whose lives are not secure, like are not safe. They could be, you know, any one of the people I've worked with, you know, or learned from are subject to police violence just by virtue of them being Black, you know, and so that, you know, I'm someone who's a person of color, but I'm not a Black person. And so what that means in the US in particular is that I still have a certain amount of privilege with respect to them. And so that's basically like, you know, it's just very much in my awareness from my life experience that this is not a joke. It's not an abstract issue. It's actually something that affects real lives on the ground, and including people I love, you know, people who have loved me. So it doesn't feel like a choice to me. It just feels like just a response to the reality I knew, you know, the response to literally what's happening outside my door and to people I love, you know.
You're being in a position where you are touring, you're recording, you're putting stuff out. You can make, I mean, not an individual, but people in general, if they do, you know, make a protest, not going on the streets, but just mention it, name a song, talk about it, you know, like we're talking an interview. That does, I think that raises awareness. And I think the more you raise awareness, you know, the chances are maybe people who are less aware of those things, you know, it'll widen their knowledge, really, because I think it's sometimes people just lead their own lives and they're not like really concerned about the other you know, the other things in the world. So I mean, I like to think that we can make a difference, even if, you know, even if it's a very small difference.
Well, I mean, I hope so. And I think, you know, music making involves a lot of hope, like a lot of optimism. You're making something for an imaginary audience at first, you know, you're making something that you hope will live on into tomorrow and into, you know, years from now. And so you do want to kind of embed it and make it like a time capsule, like, well, this is what we care about today, and I hope you care about it tomorrow. It's that kind of thing. And yes, that piece, Combat Breathing, it was more than just in response to someone's death. I mean, it was that, and his death was horrific, and but that year, 2014, which is when we made that, was the year that Michael Brown was killed. It was the year that Tamir Rice was killed. It was the year that, because of not just the three of them, but lots of others, Jordan Davis, it was the year that the movement for Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter idea and movement and kind of like on the ground insurgent community force that it became, that really took its form that it has. So that was the year of many protests across the country, starting in Ferguson in St. Louis, Missouri, with the death of Michael Brown, then one after another, and then when it's with Tamir Rice in Ohio, and then when this happened with Eric Garner in Staten Island in New York City, then like the city kind of caught fire with this sense, this urgent sense of like, wow, it's everywhere. This is everywhere. This is a problem for everybody. And so I remember then, like, people were staging these die-ins in different public places where it was really like you get in the way, you stop the gears of society by like having a bunch of people dead on the, acting dead on the ground, on the street, for example, or on, just in a public place. You block the ordinary workings of the machinery of society. And I was working at the time, I was doing this series of performances at Brooklyn Academy of Music that weekend in December. It was December of 2014, and I suddenly had this idea to do something with this group of artists, this group of dancers called Dancing While Black. That was the name of their collective, Dancing While Black, which is sort of a reference to like how people would be arrested for walking while black or driving while black, this kind of like increased police surveillance and disturbance around just Black people being themselves. So we actually did this die-in at Brooklyn Academy of Music, and this became the score to that. It was this piece of music, Combat Breathing. Some of that had to do with the fact that Eric Garner had been choked, and one of his last words were, "I can't breathe." But there was also a quote from Frantz Fanon, which I came across, which he's talking about. It's from A Dying Imperialism, and he says, under this condition, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. So that line about what it's like to live under police surveillance or under state power that is directed at its own population seemed to resonate. So we used that line, we projected it when we did this performance.
You've an interesting background, and you, again, correct me because I don't know if my homework is always correct, but I get it off the internet. So I think you mentioned your family. It says you're a son of your family they were Tamil immigrants to the US. You have a background. I find this quite interesting. You have a background in studying maths and physics at university. It says mostly self-taught pianist. I don't know how much, you mentioned you learnt violin, so I'm not sure whether you transferred your skills. And you've also got an impressive career in performing and composing. The amount of awards, I've put in brackets, of which there are many. There are so many awards that I kind of read them and I was just like, wow, wow, wow. So I haven't mentioned any because there are just so many. And I'm sure if someone Googles your name, they can look them up there. But in addition to that, you've made 23 albums, and there's a sheer variety in the music. You're from performing with your trio to composing for more, I call them classical ensembles, but non-jazz ensembles. And I think in a way this makes you one of the most interesting and successful and versatile musicians in the jazz world. And I just wondered, what's the secret? How do you attribute your success? Because there's a lot of stuff there, that I think, yeah, you don't often read about. I know there are some people, but most people don't have the amount of awards. They don't have that kind of background. They haven't done X, Y, and Z, so you sound like you're a very industrious person, very busy. Is that really what it's down to? Hard work, do you think?
I don't know how to answer any of that. I mean, first of all, I'm turning 50 I don't know when this will air, but I'm turning 50 in October. So, and I started a bit young, and I guess I'm just a little hard-headed. I don't know if industrious is the right word, but I kind of just sort of stay at something until something happens, you know. Like I just kind of and I also tend to stay with people. Like I tend to have these ongoing collaborations, like I mentioned, like and so a lot of it is about what we do together over years and years, you know. And so if I've been making music since I was a kid and I'm 50 now, so like it's a long time, right? I've had a lot of chances to try all kinds of things. The other thing is like living in New York City or a place like New York. I mean, London is not that different, actually. You get to, and actually before I lived in New York, in the 1990s, I lived in Oakland, California. And so like in all these different places, I've had chances to interact with all kinds of folks, you know, artists from every kind of walk of life. Every, you know, poets and dancers, choreographers, filmmakers, visual artists, and musicians from every community, you know, hip hop artists, DJs, electronic musicians, contemporary classical composers and performers, classical, you know, Western classical musicians, Indian classical musicians. I've just had, and I guess I've just remained open to all of that and tried to listen. You know, I think the key to it all is listening, honestly. And then I firmly believe that anybody can make music together if they take the time and really listen to one another and try to attune to each other and build something together. And yeah, I mean, and it's true that I never had piano lessons. So I'm still studying that, you know. That's,
it doesn't, yeah, it doesn't sound, I mean, we associate, you know, someone not trained as though somehow these days it's not, you know, the same, but as someone who's had, you know, classical training and stuff. But I just like to say that you would never know. I only said that because I think it's quite an unusual thing, but, you know, I don't know if, I mean, you said you'd learnt violin, so I don't know, were you doing that before you played the piano? And did you sort of, was that made it easier to cross over to the piano?
I think I've done both for my whole life. Basically, I started violin lessons when I was 3, and I also started playing piano by ear when I was 3. And they just kind of informed each other, I would say. I started picking things out by ear on the piano and like including stuff from the radio. And then I started learning a bit about harmony when I was in middle school and you know, about music theory and things like that. And then got into, I played in a rock band when I was when I was like at 14, 15 years old. And I got into our school jazz ensemble around that time too. I was playing in orchestras. I was playing in the jazz ensemble. So it was like all of this stuff was kind of happening at the same time. It wasn't one before the other or anything.
I wanted to play something that was less jazz. That's okay. And something that was perhaps showed another side of your composing. And we talked about maybe playing something from Mutations. And you said you thought number 6 was a good one. I just wondered if you, before we play this, if there's, you know, what is Mutations? Would you be able to give us a what ensemble is it for?
I started trying to write for music for classically trained musicians a little more than 20 years ago. And I'd say this is maybe the 3rd such piece I tried to write. I wasn't trying to like make classical music. I don't even know what that means actually at this point. I think like working with people who have that training means you have specific things you can do and specific things you probably shouldn't do. Like you don't want to ask someone to take a solo on blues or on giant steps or something like that, but you do maybe get to ask them to interpret things with a certain sense of freedom. So this is like this suite. It's basically a piano quintet. It's myself on piano and electronics and a string quartet. It was written in 2005 for a group called Ethel. Though the recording is a different quartet. It's a group of musicians I put together including the great Miranda Cookson on violin, who's really one of the best violinists in New York. She's an incredible champion of new music. And then also some members of International Contemporary Ensemble are on this, and I'd worked with them a bit. By the time I recorded this, I think the recording was made in 2013. But this piece was, it's a lot of short movement. It's like 10 short movements. So I'm basically building form out of a lot of small elements. And each one kind of examines the idea of mutation or change, which is like the way we create forward movement in, like, you and I are both musicians from the jazz universe. So like, someone might give you 8 bars of music and then you say, okay, like, let's play. And then you somehow something like 7 to 10 minutes long might happen out of those 8 bars, because you have this sense of how to evolve material. What I wanted to do with this piece was like try out different methods of evolution, some of which were through notated, some of which were more about choices that musicians were able to make.
I was going to say, obviously, it's brilliant to have musicians coming to the UK. And obviously, things have been put on hold for a while. And I just wondered, what were your immediate plans? Obviously coming to London, but you've got presumably a touring schedule. So anything exciting coming up?
I'm actually on leave from teaching this year, so I'm focusing on composing. I'm writing a cello concerto and a clarinet quintet and some solo piano classical music, meaning like solo piano music for a classical pianist, and a few other projects that are keeping me very busy right now. So yeah, I'll be working, and hopefully there'll be something new to hear within not too long.
You've been listening to Andrea Vicari on Jazz London Radio, and this was Jazz Doodles.
The JLR interview series.